welcome you to this final day of our 5th annual World Catholicism Week. This year's final event is particularly poignant since we're collaborating with the Conference on Death Penalties, co-sponsored by DePaul Humanities Center and the Institut Français. In particular, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Jonathan Gross, Director of the Humanities Center, Elizabeth Rotenberg from the Department of Philosophy, and also Suzanne Dumbleton from the School for New Learning for all that they did to make this collaboration possible. This evening we celebrate the 3rd annual Peter Vincent Byrne Lecture with a presentation on the relationship between spirituality and social justice. Father Byrne was the first president of DePaul. His picture is directly behind you on the wall back there. An Irish Vincentian who's been frequently compared to the famed architect Daniel Burnham. Like Burnham, he made no small plans and knew that small plans have no magic to stir our blood. He started an ambitious building project, introduced an elective system, and most decisively put into the charter of at the founding of DePaul University that there be no religious test for admission or for an appointment to the faculty. This lectureship has highlighted similar innovations. The first Byrne Lecture was given by the British theologian Graham Ward, who spoke on urban studies in the mirror of World Catholicism. Last year, it was jointly offered by our current president, Father Dennis Holzschneider, and the president of the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, Father Jose Morales Carrasco. And they spoke about solidarity across the borders. We come this evening to hear one of the most profound religious innovators of our generation, one whose life and work truly gives expression to the highest ideal of the Byrne Lectureship. Sister Helen Prejean is a member of the Congregation of St. Joseph. She began her prison ministry in 1981 when she dedicated her life to the poor of New Orleans. You might hear some of that accent in her speech, I don't know. While living in the St. Thomas Housing Project, she became pen pals with Patrick Saunier, the convicted killer of 2 teenagers, sentenced to die in the electric chair of Louisiana's Angola State Prison. She turned her experiences into a bestseller book and later a film known as Dead Man Walking, an eyewitness account of the death penalty in the United States. Another book came out in 2005 under the title The Death of Innocence. This book includes a fascinating account of her actual conversations with Justice Antonin Scalia about the Catholic underpinnings of jurisprudence on this question. Justice Scalia knew about Sister Helen because he'd gone duck hunting with her brother Louis. When Louis informed the justice of the film that resulted from the book, he is reported to have said, "Just what we need, another anti-death penalty film by a bunch of liberals." So Sister Helen has taken on great causes in her life. In December of 2000, Sister Helen Paul Hoffman of Amnesty International and Mario Marazziti, representative of the San Egidio Community in Rome, presented Kofi Annan, then Secretary General of the UN, with 2.5 million signatures from people all over the world calling for a moratorium on the death penalty. She's engaged these struggles with the world through the UN, with Justice Scalia, through her brother, with considerable grace, wisdom, and wit. Please join me in welcoming Sister Helen Prejean.
I'm also a part Cajun, and we love storytelling. Because if you sit down to a table in the backyard that's covered with newspaper, and you got boiled crawfish, and you got a Dixie long neck beer, and you're there for 3 hours eating. If you don't know stories, you don't get invited to the crawfish bar. It's just part of being together out of a Southern culture, and my mother and father both. Just telling a story. It's very oral, very. So here we are together in this moment of grace, really. Because of all the things in the universe, here we are being brought together for this precious hour. And so I'm going to take you into my heart. And this incredible journey, which of course we all are on, I'm going to tell you that, you know, I was in prison, you came to me. How many times, I wonder if there would be a way that it could be computerized and quantified. How many times, starting from the time as a young Catholic girl in Catholic school, I had heard those words from Scripture. Until the time they finally caught fire. In Australia, the Aboriginal people used to have something called fire farming. And they would go to a patch where there were small trees and shrubs, and they would set fire to them, knowing that there are some seeds that are only come to life in fire. Then they'd come back 6 weeks later, and the new growth was there, the animals were there, and they could hunt. So in a way, I guess it was the Holy Spirit fire farming with me, with the seed. I was in prison and it came to me. And I guess it's such a natural thing. The Scriptures, you know, we can all frame them and say, oh yeah, I know that story, this is going to be the Good Samaritan, or this is going to be the sower and the seed, or this is going to be... And I was in prison and he came to me, of kind of framing them in a way like, yeah, I know what that means. Until the day they catch fire and your whole life changes because of them. The way I'm going to begin my spiritual memoir called River of Fire, my spiritual journey, is with this prelude. They killed a man with fire one night. They strapped him in a wooden chair and pumped electricity through his body until he was dead. His killing was a legal act because he had killed. No religious leaders protested the killing that night, but I was there and I saw it with my own eyes. And what I saw set my soul on fire, a fire that burns in me still. Now here is an account of how I came to be in the killing chamber that night and the spiritual currents that pull me there. The spiritual currents have to do with awakening to the gospel of Jesus, which comes to us in seed form through however it comes to us as Christians, and then sometimes it breaks open, as it has for me, and as it does for all of us, I think. But it's just to simply give witness to the story of how grace has been active and what has happened. Because it's all about that when we become truly enlightened about something, that we can see the spiritual trajectory of our life changes, we know that's grace. And we have a maxim in our community, never leap ahead of grace. Well, boy, I used to be a leaper. I would leap with grace, I'd leap without grace. But I'm an extrovert and I'm a doer, and I was always out there. Not all of it graceful, as you can imagine. But this awakening, it had to do with the awakening that the gospel of Jesus was about being on the side of people that don't have a voice, being on the side of people who are disrespected, who are discounted, who are marginalized. Because for a long time, I thought what Christianity was about and following Jesus, and I was a nun, and I am a nun. I thought it meant being prayerful and holy, and I was, well, if you'll excuse the expression, I was hell-bent on being a saint when I joined the sisters. And I wanted to pray, a little levitation, I just thought, I read about, Teresa and Evelyn, those people that be so close to God, their bodies would lift the ground. And it's not like I was directly seeking levitation, but a little mystical experience wouldn't be bad. I tried to do everything I was taught to really try to be holy. And I get to tell that story in River of Fire because, of course, it goes to the days of being a nun before Vatican II, when the whole thing was to leave the wicked world so you could be holy and be a bride of Christ, go out to teach the children, come back to the convent, and then you're doing penances and all to make yourself worthy for the mystical graces. And I even begin the book with kissing 1,000 feet. I must have kissed 1,000 feet. We had these penances you could do where you kneel at the front door where of the dining room, the sisters would come in and they'd put their shoe out and they'd kiss their foot. So you kiss feet, that shows I'm really humble. Sister, I'm not worthy to stand as your equal, I will kiss your foot. So Paul kissed a lot of feet and trying to be humble. And of course, egos in all this, you look back on it afterwards and going, so I'm the most outstanding foot kisser in the community. I mean, chalk it up. How many feet did you kiss? Well, I kissed. And it's so easy. It's just us. It's just who we are, right? And so for a long time, it was my understanding of the gospel was to be charitable to people. And so I love the kids I taught. 7th and 8th graders, that's like being in a room full of Alka-Seltzers. I love those kids. And Sister Joanna and I, we started the Action Kids, and we'd do stuff together, and taught them English, taught them religion. Loved them. But I didn't know about justice. And we started a debate in the community because the civil rights movement had happened, which, by the way, just passed me by, because I was learning how to play my guitar. We all became the singing nuns after this Dominica, Dominica. We all got guitars when you hit your final vowels. What would you like? I'd like a guitar. I want to be a singing nun. And in the laundry practicing, C, A minor, F, and G7. You can do a lot of songs with just those 4 chords. And here I am practicing the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. And the windows were rattling with the wind blowing and the civil rights movement happening in New Orleans all around me. But I wasn't awake. I just knew how to kind of sing the song. And the awakening that happens in us is always grace. And so in the debates in the community on the death penalty, not on the death penalty, on social justice, first I was a resistor to this thing of this social justice stuff. Because I'd get up to the mic and I'd say, look, we nuns. We're not social workers. How are we going to be doing all this justice stuff? If the poor know about God, they have everything, not like bread alone do people live. And I'd never been to one of the inner city housing projects in New Orleans. We had 10 major housing projects, and I lived out in the suburbs, and I've never been to any of them. And the awareness now, looking back in my life, of how privileged I was growing up in Baton Rouge. The only way I knew African American people, actually, was people who were the servants in our household. My daddy was a successful lawyer. So there was Ellen working in a house with Mama and taking care of us, and there was Jesse working in the yard. I didn't even know their last names. So this whole thing of social justice comes up, and the gospel called us to justice. I really didn't get it. I was sincere in it, and I didn't get it. And then I heard it talk. And that's the way the Holy Spirit gets us. It could be a talk, it could be a book, it could be a meeting, it could be a class, it could be anything. And then this talk, this nun, Sister Maria Gustinil, talked to us, and here was the line. Here was the line that changed everything, and that's how I know it's grace. Jesus preached good news to the poor, and I thought surely she would say how every hair he had was its number, not a sparrow falls to the ground, how much God loves each of us. And she said, integral to the good news Jesus preached to poor people was that they would be poor no longer. And I came to realize all the theology I learned, I'd just kind of taken it for granted, that poverty was like God's will for people. It wasn't to be resisted. It wasn't to be changed. Faith didn't call you to resist poverty. It's just like poor people going to suffer with Jesus on the cross. One day they're going to have a great reward, but you don't get in there and try to change that. Why do we still have, 42 million people in this country who are still living in poverty? Well, clearly one factor in it is that we kind of tend to accept, well, if people are poor, they haven't taken advantage of the great American dream, because anybody who wants to do something with their life here can. Don't talk to me about slavery. Don't talk to me about how bad people had it before. It's their own daggone fault if they're poor, is basically what you hear. And you hear people like in the Tea Party saying, entitlement programs, as it's called, for people to have jobs and minimum wages that are adequate for the needs of people, or housing, or health care. How has it lasted so? And I'm part of the reason why it's lasted so long, because I didn't get the connection between my faith and getting in there with people for just what are our human rights, our civil rights, our rights as human persons to live. Because I was separated from poor people. It's not that I was bad, I just didn't know. And when Marie Augusta Neal said that, I got it. And I moved into the St. Thomas Housing Projects. And I want to say, spiritually, it doesn't matter when we wake up. It's when we wake up, we got to move and we got to act. Consciousness and conscience is very close in us. And so I moved into the St. Thomas Housing Projects, and for the first time I had African American people as my peers and really as my teachers. They taught me about the other America. They taught me about what it was to be African American, not having the resources of a daddy who was a lawyer, not having the resources of a daddy and mother who were well respected in the Catholic Church and would know the bishops, know the people in the city. Because my father was a successful businessman, no resources, African American, trying to make your way, going to a public school. This shocked me. This shocked me. Because I'd gone to St. Joseph Academy, a Catholic school. And by the time I was a junior in high school, I knew how to do public speaking. And I learned the basics so that when I go to write a book, I know how to write, I know how to punctuate, I know how to articulate, I know how to have agency, to help change things. And here kids are coming into the Adult Learning Center in Hope House who are juniors in a public school and they couldn't read a third grade reader. Could not read a third grade reader, and they're juniors, they're going to graduate in a year, get their certificate or diploma from a high school, they can't read. And I was so shocked by this, and it threw me back on myself. Like, well, I seem to be a pretty nice person, a virtuous person, but look at all the cushions. Look at all the resources I had been given. What's going to happen to young black kids growing up in New Orleans who, even if they graduate from high school, can't read a book? What happens with their jobs? And then you could see it was like currents in a river sucking these kids under. And my friend Justice Scalia, that I've come up against in so many ways, just in the contrast of ideas, he seems to find it hard to find mitigating circumstances of why people shouldn't get the death penalty. He says, don't tell me they're young, or that their brains are different. They know the difference between right and wrong. Or don't tell me that they're mentally challenged. And he goes back for his moral criteria to what the framers of the Constitution said. He looks it up in 18th century dictionaries that mentally challenged or idiots meant that you didn't know the name of your parents and you couldn't make change. And he was one of the deciders against not killing mentally challenged people. And so when I lived with the African American people, they taught me everything. And it was seeing the suffering. I hadn't seen the suffering. You'd see about people on the news, but I hadn't seen. Here's a mother where her child in a drive-by shooting has been killed. Here's a mother trying to decide if she gets off welfare, it means her kids don't have health care, and what's she going to do? Or if she goes to get a job and she's got to get the kids taken care of, by the time she gets that minimum salary, she's still in poverty. And seeing it, and meeting real people, and seeing the suffering. And that changed my heart forever. And I became that I was not a neutral person about it. Then I realized I had to be involved. And so I began. And so while I'm in that soil, this is the beginning of Dead Man Walking, in that soil at Hope House, and then I'm learning about the saints because I was ready for them. I read Dorothy Day, I read Martin Luther King, I read Gandhi, because I'm learning now how to model my life to be a person who, once you become aware of an injustice, that you gotta act, that you gotta do something, that you can't just say, well, I'm neutral, I'm gonna go get another graduate degree in something else, this is too hard or too complex. And that's when I got an invitation one day to write this man on death row. I'm right on St. Andrew Street, coming out of the Adult Learning Center. Here comes my friend from the Louisiana Coalition on Jails and Prisons. I didn't know boo scout about prisons in Louisiana. I remember going to Camp Bairdale when we went to Girl Scout camp, and right across the road, down the road, was where Angola, the prison was. So we had in our little cabins at night in the dark saying, ooh, we better watch out, the criminals gonna get out of Angola, they gonna come here, they gonna kill us. You know, Girl Scout stories at night about those criminals down the road. And now that road is as familiar to me as the back of my hand. But the way you get pulled into grace. And I was asked to write a letter. And I thought, sure, I can write a letter. I didn't know they actually were going to kill him. It was in the early 80s, and we hadn't had an execution in 20 years. There had been an unofficial moratorium on the death penalty. I never dreamed of man I was writing a letter to that one day I'm going to be standing. That prelude of they killed a man with fire one night is going to be the end of this road. And I don't know how you teach this exactly in courses, but we need to start teaching a little bit more about how sneaky Jesus is. I think we ought to have t-shirts, Sneaky Jesus. Because I wrote that man in good faith and that I'd write to him, and then everything happened out of that. Even when and here's where we come to the words, I was in prison and he came to me. We were writing back and forth. And I realized from his letters he didn't have anybody come visit him. And he's not even asking me to come visit him. He's just writing about, that his mama couldn't come, that nobody could come really. And he was just glad I had found him, that I was praying for him. And so then I'm meditating. I follow the scriptures of the day for my meditation. And there it was, Matthew 25. And there were the words, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was in prison, and he came to me. So I said, hey, there's a man I've been writing to. And I wrote him a note, and I said, I'll come visit you sometime. I never dreamed what was going to happen out of this. And it's the way grace unfurls. We just step out. Or like our boats on the wave. We just start going with the wave. One, it's very integral the way it happened. Wasn't this big, dramatic thing. I will write to a death row inmate, he'll be executed in front of my eyes, and I will write a book. None of that. You don't know any of this. You just do it. You just try to be as faithful as you can with what you know as you go along your way. And then when I say I'll come visit him, I remember the flurry of letters, return letters, right away. Well, you're coming to visit me. Can you imagine what a visit means? When you get 1,000 signals in the course of the day that you are disposable human waste, that you're not human, just dressing in those drab prison clothes every day, waking up in the same cell every day. Some guards who treat you nice, some guards who treat you like dirt. Imagine somebody saying, I will come and visit you, the dignity of it, that you're a person, that you matter. And so in the return mail, all the forms, visitor forms, and then very simply, hey, sister, I'm a Catholic here, now would you be my spiritual advisor? Yeah, fill out the form. And then that's how I was with him when he was killed. Because at the execution happened at midnight. At 5:45, everybody had to leave the death house except spiritual advisor. Who's going to be me? And who would be with him? And watch his death and be changed forever. And it's what leads me right here to you today. It's all the same current of grace. Because when I came out of the execution chamber after he'd been killed, I realized the American people are never going to get close to this. You're never going to see this. It's a secret ritual behind prison walls. And I think support for the death penalty in 1984 when Patrick Sonia was killed was something like 84, 85%. Everybody in that cat supported this. No religious leaders were standing up. Nobody was standing up against the death penalty. But I remember thinking, I was brought in, I'm a witness, I gotta tell the story. And I didn't know how I would do it. I just, whoever would hear me talk, I'd go. Like Dennis Caleb taught sociology captive audience at Loyola University, get the death penalty none in the sociology class. And then it was that's how I learned how to shape the story. That in the beginning I'd tell the story all about the human rights of the person who's being executed. And the kids would go, what about the victims? You don't care about the victims. You never bring in about the victims. And I learned then what you really have to do in this story. And it's what Tim Robbins has done in the film. It's what he's done in the stage play. He got this from the book, is to bring people over to both sides. And if we use the Christian image of the cross, on one arm is the perpetrator who has done this unspeakable act, and then on the other arm are the victims' families. And what can we do for victims' families to help them heal after such an incalculable, inscrutable evil has happened to them? Where are we? And of course, in our society that has a penchant to go to a violent solution to solve social problems, it's, well, you select carefully. The Supreme Court has said only select the worst of the worst. And if you read Death of Innocence or Dead Man Walking 2, tell me, please, what murder is the worst of the worst? If somebody kills my mother or my little brother, every murder is the worst of the worst because we are unique and unrepeatable beings that come from God. And so it's always unique and irreplaceable, the life lost. So everything's the worst of the worst. How are you going to set up the criteria exactly that we're going to decide who dies and who lives? How do we do that exactly? Nobody knows. And what happens is because the rudder on the boat isn't working, because the criteria is all given up to, first of all, the discretionary power of prosecutors to go for the death penalty and not. From square one, we have human beings involved. And is it an election year or not? Does this person, are they going to have an opponent that's running against them for office who's really going to go after them? So they're going to be strong and show how they're strong and tough on crime or not? Is it in the 10 southern states that practice slavery that do 80% of the executions? Or is it in Michigan? And all these elements come in variables. And then, yeah, we'll go for the death penalty now. And we have a track record on this. We have Dick Dieter sitting in here, who 21 years ago began something called the Death Penalty Information Center to document what happens with the death penalty. And go on that site. Go to that, and you'll see. Overwhelmingly, it's really clear that in the over 1,000 people we've executed, 8 out of every 10 of them, it's because they killed white people. And when people of color are killed in this country, the death penalty is seldom sought. And you know what's terrible? Is the Supreme Court was presented with these facts, clearly could see the pattern in the McCleskey decision in the mid-80s, and admitted that race plays a part in the application of the death penalty, the race of the victim especially, and then said it would be too disruptive of the criminal justice system to correct it. So you have a Supreme Court that acknowledges the practice of racism and refuses to do anything about it. And with the same kinds of patterns they saw, like for job discrimination or housing discrimination, they call for a remedy. But when it comes to punishing people with death, they didn't call for a remedy. They said that would be too disruptive. All this has been shocking to me to learn how racism works even in the Supreme Court of the United States, or the way people read the Constitution and interpret it. Not just the scriptures and interpret it, but the Constitution and interpret it. I mean, we have biblical illiteracy in this country that could be on the Oprah Winfrey show. I mean, we have 10% of the American public identifying Joan of Arc as Noah's wife. And that's how bad it is. So you can do these proof quotes from Scripture. And God, it happens all the time with the death penalty. It happens on the gay issue too. Oh, here's a quote from Scripture. It happened when we had slavery. It happened when, we should let women vote. People will vote. I mean, they were quoting Genesis like, man, Eve messed up the whole thing from the very beginning, eating that apple, and we're going to let women vote, and then maybe in that emotional time of the month, and we're going to trust our democracy over the women. Women can't. You read the stuff that people were saying at that time, and that debate came up. And later we'll look back on this. We're going to look back on the death penalty too. I'm happy to be in Illinois. I know your story. I've been in and out of the state. And you know what it takes? It takes human beings just like us, on the ground, educating people. Educating people, helping people reflect. And it takes the arts. So you have plays, and you have movies, and you have music, and you have people reflecting. There are three ways, basically, I'm sure there are others, but I can think of three, in which, in a culture, we are led to deeper reflection. One is education. I witnessed that happening today in class. Peace studies going on here at DePaul. Education. And the other, spirituality, brings us to a deeper level of not just surface level of what's happening, but getting to the deeper level of what are our roots, our Jesus roots, our Christian roots, or our Buddhist roots. Or in the Quran. The Quran, every chapter except one begins with the mercy of God. We have all these ideas about things because we haven't reflected deeply, we don't know. So spirituality, and then the arts, we have those ways. We're not a reflective society in America. We go from one thing to the other, get our news on, and now, we're texting and all that. How do we stop and go deeper about things? So anyway, back to Pat Sonia, here's this man executed, but along the way, on the other arm of the cross, were the victims' families. And at first I made a terrible mistake. I didn't do it right at all. Because when I found out that I was visiting on death row, and he had a brother who was serving 2 life sentences for the same murder. One brother got death, one brother got life. And when I found out that the 2 teenage kids had been killed, their parents sent their prom photo to the New Daily Iberia, this little town in Louisiana where a lot of Cajun people live. And I looked down into the faces of those 2 beautiful young kids. David LeBlanc was only 17, Loretta Brooke was only 18, and I, of course, thought of the parents. Because it's every parent's worst nightmare. Your kids go to a homecoming football game on a Friday night, and you never see them alive again. And I thought, I ought to do something for the parents. And then I held back, and I went, no, they're not going to want to see me. They're going to hate me. I'm the spiritual advisor of the 2 people who killed their kids. I'll just cause more pain and commotion and get into big arguments on the death penalty. And I stayed away. And I met them at the worst possible time you could meet a victim's family. And it's when you're in this crucible of decision, it's the pardon board hearing 1 week before Pat's execution. And you literally, when you go into a pardon board hearing, sign the book, are you for life or death? It's just like going in a Roman Colosseum, the modern equivalent of putting your thumb up. Yeah, I want this person to live. I want to ask the pardon board to give clemency and not kill this person. Or you put your thumb down. We want justice to be carried out. We want the execution to be carried out. And I'm there with one lawyer and one psychiatrist, the three of us. All the rest of the people who were packed in the room were the kinfolk and friends of the victims' families who get caught in this current as well, because they are told by the prosecuting attorney, this is the last legal hoop you got to jump through for you to get your justice. So you have all your friends in there, and you stare down those people on that pardon board. Don't dare let them deprive you of your justice. And that's when I met them. And I met them outside the building while the pardon board was voting. The boys' parents, the LeBlancs, the girls' parents, the Borks. The Borks actually came up first, and they were furious at me. And I can't blame them. I'd done it all wrong. I hadn't even written them a note to say, I'm so sorry about your daughter. Nothing. And then they see me at the pardon board here, and why am I at the pardon board here? I'm there to ask them not to kill Patrick Sonia. So how could they not see me as an enemy? And they walked past me. They just averted their gaze, and they didn't say anything. And right behind them is the boys' parents, Lloyd and Eula LeBlanc, who had lost David. He was just 17. He was their only son. And the family name died after David's death because Lloyd and Eula were too old to have other children. And they walked right up to me. Surprised by grace. And Lloyd LeBlanc said, Sister Helen, all this time, you've been visiting those two brothers, but you didn't want to come to see us. He said, you can't believe the pressure we under with this death penalty. And I didn't know victims' families were under any pressure. I thought any victim's family would be, you get caught in it. It's a cultural thing. Yeah, sure, we want the death penalty. We've had the ultimate loss of our child, and you're offering us the ultimate penalty. We want it. He said, Sister, you need to come see us. And I pray in this little chapel. Come pray with me. And you need to walk in our shoes, and you need to know what we go through. And it was a grace I couldn't refuse. He was a gracious one. He's the hero in Dead Man Walking. I'm the storyteller. And I made a bad mistake with the victims' families at first. And I went and prayed. And we said the rosary together. One of the great things about being a Catholic is we have so many ways to pray. Ignatius of Loyola called devotion an ease in finding God. You know, the sacraments, the Eucharist, the rosary, adoration chapels where we get to contemplate, the studying of the scriptures, all of the ways to be attuned to the deeper spiritual life of love and unity that we're all being called to underneath the roiling currents of all the violence and ways that we separate ourselves out from each other. And then he brought me into his heart and shared his journey. And it was an incredible journey where he said to me, Sister, when I talk to you about pressure, the pressure that we felt in the pardon board here, he said, everybody said to me, Lord, you got to be for the death penalty. Because if you're not, it'll look like you didn't love your boy. You lost your only son and you're not going to ask for the ultimate penalty. What's wrong with you? And he said, it's not really who I am because I'm a person who's kind. I love to help people, but I'm seeing the suffering of my wife. I'd wake up, reach over to her side of the bed, Eula's in the kitchen, crying. Eula in the bathroom, crying. We had to change where we had put David in a family tomb in another little town in Thibodaux, Louisiana. We had to move his body over to St. Elizabeth Cemetery so that Eula could visit and be with her boy every day, every day. The suffering that she's gone through, my daughter Vicky. And he said, everybody was saying it to me. My wife and I actually went to Mass at different places, hoping that a priest would talk to us in the homily and say the words of Jesus about forgiving your enemy, about praying for your persecutor, about not returning hatred. And we couldn't find anybody. There was nobody's sister. And you weren't there either. And I wasn't. And he said, so what happened to me was, I went there. He said, I said, yeah, I want to see him die. I wish both brothers had gotten the death penalty. I'd love to be the one to pull the switch myself. I want to see him die. I want to see him suffer. I want to see him have some pain for the pain that they've caused in my family and in the Bork family. And then he said, I didn't like what was happening to me when I went there, because all that hatred and that bitterness, it just started taking me over. So all I could think about was, get him, get him, get him. And then he said, I kept praying. I said, help me, Jesus. I know what your gospel you call me to, but help me, help me. And finally he came to it. He said, they killed my son, but I'm not going to let them kill me. I'm going to do what Jesus said, and he set his face to go down the road of forgiveness. And then after I really got to know him, he took me back for when the sheriff's deputy came to the house that morning after David had been killed to bring him to the morgue to identify his boy's body. And he said, sister, there was my son. They pulled him out where he was there in the morgue. And I looked into his eyes, and his eyes were like, he described them as like two little bullets, I guess the eyes, because David was shot in the back of the head when he was killed, and there he was. And see, he said, I can fix things. I'm a mechanic. I can fix anything. People always bring me stuff to fix. But I looked down at my son, and I said, I can't fix this. And he said, the prayer just rose up in me that I learned as a child, said at Sunday Mass, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, over the body of my son. And sister, I came to those words in Our Father, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive. He said, sister, I didn't feel the words. But the words were bad, and I started going down that road. People think forgiveness is weak, I'm finding out. They think, oh, you killed my son, but I forgive you like I condone what you did. It's okay. Kill my son. It's okay. He said, forgiveness is weak. He said, with me, he saved my own life. They killed my son, but I'm not going to let them kill me. Maybe that's what Jesus meant when he talked to us about love of enemies. It sounds so impossible. Oh yeah, love your enemies. But maybe it means that maybe someone begins as an enemy in our life, but that we don't let the hatred or the bitterness that's going to happen to us by hating them. Sometimes it's even possible to get an identity from hating your enemy. How do I know who I am? Well, I know who I'm against. I can only tell you who I'm against and who I hate. And that happens in the long-standing conflicts we see in Palestine and Israel and in so many places in the world, and in our own hearts. And when William Faulkner got the Nobel Prize for Literature, he said the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's what I've tried to do in writing and in speaking, just to wake people up. Because I know I've met too many of the American people now. People don't reflect deeply on the death penalty. It's not one of the personal moral issues that leads people to reflect. It's very, yeah, they killed, they deserve to die, end of reflection. And so I know my mission, and it is to get on airplanes and to go and crisscross this nation. And I was just in Texas. I was in Fort Worth, Texas, and we have these, oh, Texas, they kill everybody. And you're talking to people in Fort Worth, and they're just like you. It's just that through the media thing, they got interested, they came to the talk. They don't respond any differently than people in Illinois. And most human beings, when you bring them close, because they don't know much about the death penalty, how it works, the racism in it, that it's only poor people selected. 142 wrongfully convicted people as of now. Is that the latest, Dick? We got Dick Dieter sitting in here with us. This is the man who's got he has more knowledge about the death penalty in the United States than any other individual. But 142 wrongfully convicted people have gotten off of death row, said by college volunteers in Innocence Projects, not because the appeals courts did it. They were going to let them die. It's so broken. Thank God Illinois is in there now, and now we have Maryland. In the last 6 years, 6 states have put down the death penalty. Because we have witnesses coming up. In New Jersey, when they did away with the death penalty in the legislature, 62 murder victims' families testified, don't kill for us. And now we have people who've been doing executions coming out, like Jerry Givens in Virginia. I killed 62 people. They were defenseless. I killed them. And they got the title of the article from him. I committed murder. And he was the executioner in Virginia. 62 people. And it's always, well, look, it's legal. The Supreme Court says it's okay. And many, many people shingle in some quote from the Bible, or that really in Christianity, that this is really what Jesus was about too. Tough love, right? Being tough on crime, Jesus. And if you don't know very deeply, it's easy to do the proof texting stuff. Well, I was in England recently, and they said, what is it about the American people that they still cling to the death penalty? You're the last Western industrialized nation to still have the death penalty. And I said, it's not because the people are clinging to the death penalty at all. They never have thought about it deeply. And so that's goodness. That's just that they haven't reflected deeply. Bring them there. And Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African-American justice on the Supreme Court, once said, you know, the American people say they support the death penalty, but educate the people about the death penalty. Bring them close to it, and they'll reject the death penalty. We call that the Marshall hypothesis, and that's those of us who have been working with human rights, with Amnesty, with the ACLU, with these coalitions in every state that led you, Illinois, to finally make the step in your legislature to put down the death penalty. And so we are waking up. And maybe too, the context of coming out of Afghanistan, so we sent the troops in. What happened in Afghanistan? That penchant that we have deep in us as Americans, that we're going to solve social problems by sending in the Marines and doing violence. What happened in Afghanistan? What happened in Iraq? And maybe our coming out and realizing the limits on the international scene is also where there's an awakening happening in the country of realizing, hey, have you noticed the states that use the death penalty the most have a higher rate of homicide and violence in the states that don't? What's it got to do with deterrence? And if we can be made safe, and this is a real important part of the education process that's happened in the country and is happening now, that we have a way to keep ourselves safe without killing people. And I think the road for us in our country is going to be life without parole, but eventually we're going to have to deal with that. But let people, just to assure people now that if a person doesn't get the death penalty, they're not getting out of prison to kill you or your loved ones. They're not. And Pope John Paul, in the Gospel of Life, his encyclical, said that about the death penalty when it was, you know, when Thomas Aquinas talked about supporting the death penalty, or Augustine with the Vandals right at the gates of Rome. They didn't have prisons or ways to keep people safe. So they said the state could enforce the death penalty. It was always about self-defense. It was never about vengeance and this eye for an eye, they kill, we must kill them. And then Pope John Paul also, he changed the catechism. You can read the story in my second book. And then in St. Louis, for the first time, put the death penalty in with the other pro-life issues. In 1999, he stood in St. Louis and said no to abortion, no to euthanasia, no to physician-assisted suicide, and no to the death penalty, which is cruel and unnecessary. Even those among us who have done a terrible crime have a dignity that must not be taken from them. So we are on the road, friends. We gather here this afternoon in the Spirit of Jesus and out of our faith to look at this life issue and what is our own response to it in terms of who we're going to be. Because finally, the death penalty is about us. People do terrible crimes. And I'll end by saying this. There was a man in, I think it was Oklahoma, who had done an unspeakable crime. I don't know how many people he had killed. And they allowed journalists to be with him the day before he was executed. One of the journalists said to him, very frankly, well, Mr. So-and-so, look at all the people you killed. Look at the crime you did. Can you give me one reason why the state shouldn't kill you tomorrow? And he said, yeah, I'll give you one. Because you're better than I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Helen. Extremely inspiring, moving words, very profound. With the sneaky Jesus, I hope you don't hold on to the patent for that, not just for the t-shirt, but also for a theologian. But thank you very much. We want to have a conversation with all of you. And to start that, we have two very distinguished discussions. Let me introduce the first one. Michael Baxter is a visiting associate professor in Catholic Studies here at DePaul University. A Catholic worker scholar, Michael Baxter received his PhD in theology and ethics from Duke University in 1996. Historian, theologian, and ethicist, he's currently working on a collection of essays entitled American Catholics to the Rescue, looking at the whole history of nationalism, peace-building issues, and the legacy of Catholic social teaching in the U.S. His commitments to an ethics of reconciliation are evidenced in the fact that he's currently teaching a class in DePaul in Catholic Studies and in Peace Studies entitled Coming Home from War. Please join me in welcoming Michael Baxter.
It was a nice introduction here, and that was a great talk. I knew it would be. So I'm not going to try to out-tell stories on you. But I do want to make clear at the beginning, Sister, that in my limited activism at Catholic worker communities and in the peace movement especially, I too have endured a lot of bad Bob Dylan songs by people that can't play guitar. And this is one of the things that you endure when you are part of these communities. So rather than tell stories, I want to give a little theory, not a lot, but a little theory on what I think you're doing and why I think it's so important. And I wrote it out, and I reread your book, and I wrote it out. And I gave it a little title. It's called Sister Helen Gets It Right. Personalism, Prophecy, Prudence, Politics, and Performing the Works of Mercy. There's a little alliteration in that talk. But I know, I could have said Sister Prejean gets it right too, that's 6. But, so bear with me as I try to, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about anyone else, about this, this remarkable woman, and this remarkable story, which begins like this. When Child Cullen from the Prison Coalition asked me one January day in 1982 to become a pen pal to a death row inmate, I say, sure. Dead Man Walking, Sister Helen Prejean's eyewitness account of the death penalty in the United States, as the book is described in its own subtitle, begins with a work of mercy, visiting the prisoner, or at least a variation of it, writing the prisoner, and upon receiving the letter back, writing again and again, and eventually visiting her newly found pen pal, Patrick Summier. And not only visiting him, but accompanying him in his death walk to the electric chair in the Louisiana State Prison in Angola, and in his burial, in a plot provided by her religious order, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Madai. Is that what you said? Okay, the SSJs, as we said. One work of mercy leads to another, in this case, burying the dead. And others as well. Not only corporal works of mercy, but spiritual works of mercy, counseling the doubtful, comforting the afflicted, praying for the living and the dead. That's how the book ends. Praying the rosary in the early morning with Lloyd LeBlanc, father of David LeBlanc, one of Patrick and Eddie Summer's victims. And imagining Lloyd LeBlanc recalling his murdered son David for years to come. Especially on David's birthdays. 20, 25. David getting married. Standing at the back door with his little ones clustered around his knees, grown-up David, a man like himself whom he will never know. Forgiveness is never going to be easy. Each day it must be prayed for and struggled for and won. I love this passage. I love reading it to my students in my class Introduction to Catholicism. It provides them with a glimpse as to how a person, or in this case two people, are able to pray their way through death into life. A way that opens up by means of forgiveness, practicing the works of mercy. It gets some of the students crying. I get me a little crying just reading it here. Which I take to be a good thing, for perhaps it resonates with the heartbreak and losses in their own lives. So perhaps they will be drawn to pray their own way through the deaths they have experienced and are experiencing into new life. When Lloyd LeBlanc first accosted Sister Helen, offended and perhaps even outraged by her attention to Patrick Summier, but not to him and his wife, he declared, "Sister, we're good Catholics." We can assume, I think, that he'd been praying his way through his life up to that point, and that this lifetime of praying gave him the wherewithal to pray through the loss of his son, the terrifying images that must have haunted him, the emptiness of the house without him, the irremediable sadness he and his wife would forever carry. In the course of her story, Sister Helen reveals her own Catholic habits, praying usually in the morning, as I could gather, with the scriptures, making entries in her journal, also taking up some spiritual reading. Her habits of prayer with her community as well, and her friendships with the other sisters, and the support of her family. These are practices that make it seem natural, second nature, to respond to a request that some would find daunting. Sure. To attend an execution so disturbing it makes you vomit. Because he, the one executed, is the least of my brothers. To start visiting another death row inmate, Robert Lee Willie, because he too, although much less likable, or perhaps because of that, is the least of my brothers. And because what you do to the least among you, you do to me. This passage from Matthew 25, 31 to 46, was a favorite of Dorothy Day's, whose Sister Helen mentions as an influence during her awakening to the work of social justice in the early 80s. Dorothy, as followers and fellow travelers still call her, was a co-founder along with Peter Warren of the Catholic Worker in 1933, and she remained its matriarch until her death in 1980. Dorothy's approach was simple. When you see that a person is hungry, you feed her. Naked, you clothe him. Homeless, you invite them in. The name for this approach was personalism, a mid-20th century philosophy propounded by Emmanuel Mounier, French philosopher, that is best summed up by what it opposes. It opposes collectivism, with fascism and communism, or the individualism or atomism of capitalism and modern democracy. Personalism is set against large-scale bureaucratic solutions to economic and social problems. It is resistant to a state-centered conception of politics and wary of reformist projects. Far better it is, personalists like Dorothy and Peter and their contemporary heirs would say, to construct alternative small-scale practice-based communities in which the works of mercy can be performed as a way of life. Hence the constellation of houses of hospitality around the country and beyond, as well as small farms, or at least large gardens. Ventures designed for living on the land that Peter Moore called agronomic universities. The intention was to construct, again in Peter Moore's words, a new society within the shell of the old. A vision that a phrase that he took from the Wobblies, a radical labor group, but also resonates with the Apostle Paul's vision of the old and new eons and the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. Given this Christian personalist approach, it's not surprising that Dorothy and Peter would be regarded as prophetic. So too Sister Helen. To be a prophet is to speak on behalf of another. God in the first place, like the prophets in Scripture, thus saith the Lord. And also God's people, especially those with no voice. To be a voice for the voiceless was how Oscar Romero described his task as bishop in San Salvador. Sister Helen took up the same task in speaking out against the death penalty. Her stance carries authenticity and authority because she knows people on death row, knows their faces, their accents, their stories, their families, their victims' families. A genuinely prophetic stand is rooted in personal knowledge of the people on whose behalf one is speaking. A friend of mine in the Catholic Worker once told me that after listening to a talk at a conference on homelessness, the question that immediately springs to her mind is, can you name 3 people on welfare? The same personalist approach is taken by Kathy Kelly, an anti-war activist in Chicago here, who has traveled to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan more than 70 times, there to meet the people affected by U.S. wars, and then to return with word of their struggles and sufferings back to us, including us here at DePaul, every other quarter or so. There are plenty of examples of people whose personalist action grounds their prophetic speech in witness. Prophecy, prophetic action, is worth lingering over a bit because it has come under some suspicion in recent years. One scholar, a legal scholar and ethicist at the University of Notre Dame, for example, criticizes taking a prophetic stance for being so principled that it is unwilling to engage in the detailed applications of principles in actual cases. That is, it is unwilling to engage in moral casuistry involved in determining the proper means to achieve good ends. It lacks in the word prudence. The primary targets of Caden's criticisms are right-wing Catholics, as she calls them Rambo Catholics, who decry abortion, gay marriage, embryonic stem cell research, and so on as intrinsic evils that must be opposed unequivocally, and fail to delve into the complex matters of law, politics, and moral deliberation. But Caden's criticism is also aimed secondarily at those on the left whose stances take on a prophetic or radical quality. Catholic worker types, pacifists, protesters of the system, hurling their utterances down like lightning bolts, refusing to engage in any real dialogue with others, or interested only in band-aid kind of work. I think of Dan Baird, he often receives that same criticism, and his papers are here in our archives too. This is an inaccurate portrayal, if not a cheap shot, at poor Dorothy and the Catholic Worker. But rather than defend her movement, it seems more fruitful to suggest an alternative. And on this score, Sister Helen's account in Dead Man Walking is so helpful. For she is no closed-minded sectarian, world-rejecting nun that wants to turn Louisiana into a church, much less a convent. Not only does she visit the prisoners, she stands on picket lines, visits with the warden, appeals to the governor's boards of pardons. At one point, she virtually hears the confession of a former head on that board for taking bribes after his conviction. She also works with the ACLU, cites studies by Amnesty International, co-founds an anti-death penalty organization in Louisiana, joins forces with Hollywood in turning her book into a movie, travels the country giving talks like this one, and has even turned over her papers to DePaul. All of which indicates a readiness to exercise, I would say, the virtue of prudence, to enter into the so-called public square when it comes to working to abolish the death penalty, which is, as we've heard, racist, classist, discriminatory, dehumanizing, barbaric, cruel and unusual, and flatly repugnant to the gospel. All of that. An approach grounded in faith and reason both, which in the Catholic tradition are regarded as two avenues to truth, although the former takes precedence, so that reason, in this case practical reason and prudence, is elevated, corrected, and perfected by faith. I'd like to suggest that in one way, that's one way to understand your story. So then, is Sister Helen's work political? The answer is yes and no. Inasmuch as her fending for people on death row and opposing the death penalty leads her to push for reforms in the prison system, changes in laws and regulations regarding capital crimes, working for the end of all executions by the state, yes, her work is political. But it is not political in the conventional partisan sense. In reading Dead Man Walking, it's not difficult to pick up on her contempt for the Reagan administration policies, which were gutting social programs to the poor during the years that Sister Helen went to work in the poor neighborhood of St. Thomas in New Orleans. However, I venture to say that this by no means makes her a Democrat in the partisan sense, or if so, a very wary one. For not long after, in January of 1992, around the time when this book first appeared, a mentally retarded man by the name of Ricky Ray Rector was executed by lethal injection in Arkansas, and the governor of that state refused to grant him clemency. In fact, boasted about being tough on crime, an attempt to preempt being tarred with any soft on crime Willie Horton brush that would have stopped in its tracks Governor Bill Clinton's bid for the presidency. In our increasingly homogenized political culture, where leaders of both parties are ready to sacrifice one man for the good of the nation, or the good outcome in a national election, that political culture and politics, and the politics it breeds, must be rejected. Sister Helen says as much in the most politically provocative chapter in her book, when she states quite simply that the state cannot be trusted with the power over life and death. Repeat. The state cannot be trusted. A claim made on grounds of faith, inasmuch as Jesus taught us not to kill, and was himself put to death by execution by the state, and on grounds of reason, such as those put forth by Albert Camus, a mid-20th century French Algerian atheist, existentialist, whose essays and novels are a powerful witness against state-sponsored killing, which Sister Helen has relied on. Another way to put this, Sister Helen's politics come in the classical Aristotelian mode, political community based on the common good, which is clearly opposed and constantly wary of the politics of a modern nation state. Sister Helen may not theorize her political vision like this, but one need not theorize Aristotle to practice politics in a way that is Aristotelian. All of which is to say that Sister Helen gets it right when it comes to personalism, prophecy, prudence, politics, and performing the works of mercy. Especially when it comes to the latter, which is the most important. For our lives consist of a journey from prison to mercy. We have all been in prison, locked up in disobedience, Jew and Gentile alike, as the Apostle Paul assures us. But this, only that we may be shown the mercy of God and embody God's mercy in the world. Without embodying it, the mercy of God is nothing more than an idea or a rumor. Thank you, Sister Helen, for living so as to make God's mercy real and therefore prompting us, when asked to do some simple act of mercy, to respond by saying, sure, and for teaching us that mercy is to be one again and again today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our second respondent is David Kelly. David Kelly is a Catholic priest of the Missionaries of Crescent Flood and has a DMin from our partner here in Chicago, the Catholic Theological Union. He's Executive Director of the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, PBMR, a restorative justice project and community in the Back of the Yards and Englewood communities of Chicago. PBMR is a resource, a very valuable one, to other groups and communities who seek healing and reconciliation. Additionally, he's worked for Colba House at Assumption Church, a parish-based jail ministry of the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he's done this since 1985. And for more than 30 years, he's worked as a chaplain in Cook County Jail and Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And during that time, he's also worked in inner-city parishes. Please join me in welcoming Father David Kelly.
Reflect a little bit on what it meant to be a respondent to Sister Helen. I think the most powerful thing that I can say in her story is her willingness to say that how she got into this work was not by some stance on study or academia, but by sheer being transformed and moved by stories and the faces and the personalities and the experience she encountered along the way. Just as perhaps the story of Emmaus teaches us, rarely do we set out on a journey where we know where it's going to go. But if we're open to the Spirit along the way, if we're willing to accept the twists and the turns of life, and willing to be humble, then we can be led. And if we're faithful in following, then it brings great joy. I work for a Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, but I'm the old-style priest. I went to seminary when I was 14. I moved away from the house 200 miles from my home. Later, I asked my mom, why would you ever leave your child at the age of 14? But it was the day that happened. Mom said, you don't stand in the way of being a priest. So I went through 4 years of what we call minor seminary, and then another 4 years of college. And in college I took pre-med. I didn't think I was going to be a priest, so I thought I wanted to leave here with a marketable degree. Not to put down, of course, Mary Jean philosophy, but I didn't want to leave with a philosophy degree because I wasn't quite sure what I would do with a philosophy degree in a career. So I took pre-med. And I took the coursework, the philosophy, and the psychology, and the Latin and the Greek back then that you needed to have in order to be in the seminary, because I was still in the seminary technically. But it was in the 70s, the seminary had been kind of blown up by it. And at the end of my senior year, I thought, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. I didn't feel that deep desire to go on and study theology. I didn't know about whether I wanted to be a doctor, and I was in a great turmoil. I went to live in an inner-city parish in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's an African-American parish, and I experienced something radically different in my life, a spirituality that came alive. When I did that, I also worked as a volunteer social worker at the Cincinnati Workhouse, which was a correctional facility built for Civil War prisoners. It had running water in many parts of the building. And we had to move our desks around when it rained because we had to kind of dodge the water coming through the ceilings. But at that moment, I felt more alive than I'd ever felt before in my vocation. And because of that experience of being in that correctional facility, in spite of the system, and because of the relationships that I encountered there, I came to Chicago and I studied at CTU. When I came to Chicago and studied at CTU, I went to the Juvenile Detention Center as an intern, field ed practicum. I stayed there. I've been there ever since. Save 3 years, in which I worked in Dayton, Ohio, and Montgomery County Jail as a juvenile detention center. And I petitioned my provincial if I could be a part of this new ministry called Colby House at Assumption. The ideal was that the things that people who are incarcerated most need is to feel like they belong, like they are connected. Because prison, by definition, is isolation. And there's no worse torture than being isolated. As though you can scream as loud as you want, and nobody is going to hear you. And if they do hear you, they're really not going to care. So the idea was to create this ministry, this new ministry, that reached out to people who were in jail and put it in a parish, and the parish would be this welcoming parish. So that those who are coming out of prisons and jails would find a faith community that was willing and ready and wanting of them being with them. So that's what we did. And that's what I still work for Colby House. I left the parish recently. But what I found along the way as I accompanied these families whose children were getting these extreme sentences, children 14 years old getting life without parole in prison, children getting 60 years in prison. And as I worked with those families and walked through that system with those families, because of where I lived and the parish was on gang boundaries, I found myself also bearing many, many 15, 16, and 17 years old. And I found myself accompanying those families as well. And too often, because I lived in that community, I knew the one who killed the one I just buried. And as I went to court, as Sister Helen spoke up, court doesn't allow you to kind of embrace both. They really want you choose. Depending upon where you sit, you're either sitting on the side of the one who did the harm, or you're sitting on the side of the state, who has the voice for the one who has been victimized, who was harmed. I felt like I needed to take a lawn chair and kind of put it in the middle, because I was a community person and I couldn't see myself embracing only one family. They're both part of our community. And that's what led me and some others in my community to begin, because part of our charism is reconciliation. That's what led us to begin this ministry of reconciliation. Not just a word, not just a charism, but how do we live it? And not just part of a school where you have reconciliation as a part of the coursework, not just part of a parish where you try to do some reconciliation and hear a lot of confessions, but rather what does it mean to live reconciliation, to bring together those who are apart, to be ambassadors of that kind of inclusion. So we began this ministry in the Inglewood and Back of the Arts community on the south side of Chicago. That was to reach out and embrace families who have been harmed, families and peoples who have done the harm, and to try to create, as I heard the past president of Ireland say, a space for grace. A place that people could come together to create this space where people could really come together and hear one another. And so we began the Ministry of Reconciliation, Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. And what we do there is try to create these places and times intentionally, using restorative justice as a philosophy. Restorative justice says, when there's a violence, when there's a crime, when there's a harm, what if you address the harm? What's the harm done? And how can we then begin and strive to repair the harm? Versus our system that we have here in the States, which is a punitive system, which asks what law was broken, who did it, and how much are we going to punish them so they don't do it again. So we have a lot of minimum mandatory kind of sentences to try to deter people. But this ministry was to take a different approach, a different philosophy, repairing harm, bringing folks together. So we create this ministry of reconciliation, restorative justice practice. And we use peacemaking circles. It's a practice of restorative justice that's so Catholic in every way. When I opened the book, when I was seeking out some way to do this ministry, I knew who I wanted to impact. I didn't know how I could do it. You just don't walk up the street and say you want to come and sit down with the person who just did you wrong. You got to find ways to do that. And so this was a way of practice that was based on storytelling and based on relationships and based on symbols and signs and rituals that bring peoples together. And so we create this kind of environment, a welcoming, hospitable place where we are willing to accompany those who have been harmed and willing to accompany those who have done the harm. And when possible, and when they're ready, to sit down together and to create an environment where we can start to address the harm that's done. We do this pilot project with one of the courtrooms in calendar 55 juvenile court in Inglewood. We had this case where the judge sent us a case where a kid had burglarized a home. And so they wanted us to do a peacemaking circle. Use a restorative practice on this particular case. And so I reached out to the young man to see if this is something he really wanted to do. If he just wanted to get out of court as quick as he could, he would agree to anything. And he said, yeah, I'd like to do that. I want to see the person who I did harm to. I want to apologize. That's what I asked him. I said, what would you say to him? And he said in a host of ways, I'd tell him how sorry I was. And his mother was there with him. And she too was one of those mothers that she wasn't going to cover up for him. But she loved him. She wasn't going to get him off the hook. He needed to fess up and be held accountable. But she loved him. So she would be willing to sit in that circle as well and face the person who her son had burglarized. So then I reached out to the person whose home was burglarized. I said, would you be willing to take part in this kind of a process? And I went to visit him. And he said, yes, I would. And so we created this time through logistics. We said, okay, and they met at our center. And because the young man and his mother couldn't get there on their own, I went down to pick them up. And I had a co-keeper, we call him, who was waiting for the person who was victimized to get there. He said he could get there on his own. And as I was down picking up the young man, the person whose home was burglarized arrived, and he seemed a little bit more agitated, less open than what he sounded when we went to visit him. He really had a few things he wanted to tell this kid. And so my co-keeper was getting a little nervous about how this might go. So then I arrived and we did our pleasantries, the awkward moments as you can imagine, and we sat down in a circle. Before we said what happened, we said, who are we? And we began to tell stories of who we are. And the young man was able to tell a story about how he never knew his father, and about how he was recently put out of school, and a host of other things. And the person whose home was victimized said he was a police officer. And he started to tell about what really was the problem, what really got him was not so much that some laptops were taken, but rather that his little son who was 5 years old said, Daddy, I don't want to live here no more. This is no longer safe. And how he felt as an African-American father that he couldn't even keep his own home safe for his son. And that's what really stirred him. And the mother was able to speak about how hard it was to raise a child in Inglewood who's 17 years old, how she feared every time he walked out that door that he might not be coming back. And we told stories. And then when I asked to talk about this, what happened, each told what happened. And ultimately we get to a point where we say, what do you need? And I said, ask the person whose home was victimized, what do you need to help repair this harm? And he said, man, I don't need anything. Because throughout, the young man was apologizing. Sincere apology. Then he caught himself, the police officer whose home was burglarized. And he looked directly at the kid and he said, young man, you need to go to school. You're a great kid. And we need more young African-American youth to grow up and be educated so that others will follow. And as we finished this circle, the officer got up, because during the circle he also told about how he was a coach. And the kid had talked about how he loved basketball. But he was out of school, and the nearest place where he could play basketball was across a couple gang lines. So the officer gave him his card. Now mind you, this is the kid who burglarized his home. I don't know where he lived anyhow, but gave him his card and said, let's go play basketball. So the victim became the mentor. The one who was harmed became the one who bridged the gap. That's what can happen when you don't just focus on issues, but you rather focus on relationships. Restorative justice is very simple. It's basically, how would you want it if it was your child? How would you want things if you were your child? My father was a World War II vet, spent 2 years in Europe during World War II. He was a stern man, worked in the same factory for 40 years. He demanded accountability. But we always knew in that accountability that we were finite, that nothing we could do would ever sever that love he had for us. I suggest to you that our kids are growing up feeling unloved, unconnected. Carl Bell says it well. He says, hurt people hurt people. So the whole idea of the ministry of reconciliation to counter the violence that we hear that is almost becoming Chicago is to start to begin to heal the hurts. And we use a restorative approach. We make connections. We build relationships. And through those relationships, people become healed. Or they're on that way for healing. Kids are growing up in Chicago, at least. That's all I know. All my adult life has been in Chicago. Kids growing up knowing that they are vulnerable. Too many of their brothers, sisters, fathers, uncles, cousins, friends have been killed. When I was their age, I still thought I was like Superman. But our kids are growing up at a very young age knowing I am vulnerable. I've heard many a kid say, when I say, man, happy birthday, man, I made it to 16. Didn't think I was going to make it. Kids are having children because they want to leave something behind because they feel like they're going to die. Literally, that's what the kid told me the other day in juvenile. You know why I had a kid? He's only 16. I said, man, what do you want to have a child 16? He says, man, I just want something. I want to leave something. Kids know they're vulnerable. Kids know the neighborhood is not safe. They know that as soon as they walk out that door, they become hyper-vigilant. They're watching. They know every car that goes by. They're constantly on guard. They can't walk from one school to another. They can't go to the local park. They know that it's dangerous. And here's the third thing that is most telling, and I think most challenging to you and me. They know that adults will not protect them. They believe that adults will not protect them. Even though we want to, and so often we do, too often they believe that. So my challenge to all of us is to create these spaces and places, to open the doors a little bit wider, to be a little bit more inclusive, and to allow people to come together and to build relationships with one another. Because ultimately, it's about relationships. Ultimately, we're moved not by theory, but by stories, by hearing one another, being moved by one another, being moved by people who we didn't know we ought to, or we were afraid to move into that area. To create these places and times where we can really live out our common humanity.
Okay, it's on. So I'm hearing threads in all of you that are similar. Wake up, go sit with the poor, be there, hear it, listen. That sounds remote to some extent. Do you have on the ground, how do we hear, how do we listen to the families of the 509 murder victims in Chicago last year? How do we hear the stories of the collateral damage of our drone strikes, where we are the murderers? really. There are drones. I mean, great Kathy Kelly and Jerica Arendt's faculty members here can be in Afghanistan this week, and they get to listen on the ground. How can we listen? Students, how do we step forward and take our stand in the world as we major in our various things? Thoughts on the ground stuff, any of you, all of you? Thank you. Not too sure.
Start anywhere. You know what? We can ask questions forever. Where? How? How will we do this? What about the drones? What about... Start anywhere. Start in a nursing home. Start in a place to tutor kids. Start anywhere. Because when you put your boat in the current, that becomes the teacher. Sometimes we try to think too much. We try to get a blueprint. Just where should I start? Let me look. There's this. And the more we're thinking and the more we're planning, it's like a thing of start anywhere. There are people hurting all around. What Father Dave was saying, that's the road we gotta start going on. And until I met real people, it was less than a 16th of a mile to travel from the suburbs of New Orleans to the inner city and to live in the St. Thomas Housing Project. But spiritually, I had to travel a galaxy because I was trying to work everything with my mind. And then I just went and met the people, and then the people teach us. It's an act of faith and trust to get out and just get in there.
You know, just another story too, or example. You know, I teach a course on war, nuclear weapons, and for a whole quarter, I was talking about nuclear weapons and telling a couple of war stories from Iraq that I had read. And one student was real skeptical about one of these stories, and another student speaks up and says, "Oh, I think that's a good story, because I was there." And the whole quarter, I didn't know. I'm talking about war. And the whole quarter, he's sitting there as a vet. And this is 4 quarters ago, winter of 2012. Now, since then, I've come to learn there are 550 student vets at DePaul. It turns out I have 5 or 6 every quarter in my courses. And I'm teaching a course for coming home from war, and they're right there. So it really is the case of just like opening our... just one other example about DePaul. One of the things that I've come to see about DePaul is the students work hard. And they work hard at jobs beyond school. And they labor under this deal where they have to go into debt so that they can go to school. And then they spend all their time trying to stay out of debt. And when they graduate, then they have to spend years paying it back. And that shapes their life decisions. And they think they can't do things like live with the poor because they have to pay off this debt. So there's ways in which, say, here at DePaul, which has got a great legacy, we should take on the issue of student debt that people labor under and come up with creative solutions. And it'll free people to do just what you did and to what we're all called to do. Just go.
I'm Pam Sittenbaum. I'm the executive director of the Chicago Innocence Project, and we're journalists, and so I appreciate the reference to storytelling, because that's what we do. And I'm thrilled to say that we have a huge number of phenomenal DePaul students, who we train in investigative reporting and who are currently working on cases in Englewood, and who use investigative reporting techniques to interview people, re-interview witnesses, reenact the crime scene, look for inconsistencies, or gumshoe reporting, and it's been extraordinary. So there are all kinds of, and that's just one, and they get internship credit, so it's, right, We don't pay them, I wish we could, but they get an extraordinary life experience. So there are all kinds of ways that your students, who are just really extraordinary, I have to say, who are doing this kind of work. And it's really everywhere. It really is everywhere. There's so many of us who are doing not-for-profits, who are looking for, come talk to our students, come give a talk on restorative justice. That, I love it. Invite other organizations to come to your classes and have them explain what they do. Right? A career day, invite some of us old lefties and we'll come and share what we do. And the students can get involved and you could too. So we're out there. I was going to say, actually that's not what I was going to say, so what I wanted to, sorry. I wanted to say that I came here so tired and so weary and so uninspired and so sad because I have thousands of letters and many of them actually are really innocent. And it's going to take us forever to get through, and if it sucks to be guilty in prison, it really sucks to be innocent. And I just want to ask Sister Helen if she remembers, I was 23, and a reporter at the Times picked you, which made you 29, and I was working on a case of a clearly innocent man who was about to get the death penalty, and I had been convicted, and I felt, I was a young reporter, and I felt that I had failed. The judge had privately told me the guy's innocent, and I called Sister Helen, and I wept, and I wept, and I wept, and I said, I'm done. I can't do this. This is, and I have completely failed. And you said, do you think that I failed? And I said, what do you mean? And you said, every man I walk with dies. I don't save anybody. And that was a moment of grace for me, which kept me on the path. So I guess I wanted to say that I'm so happy to see you. And I hope everyone understands that what these folks do is really extraordinary. And if you're feeling a little tired and lost, it's good to be.
I'm Sister Betty Ann McNeil, a daughter of Charity, and I have the privilege of working in university mission and values. And I just want to reaffirm what each of you said in your own unique and very inspiring ways. But DePaul is a Vincentian university, and Vincent DePaul did not start out with a game plan or a master plan, nor did Louise Jamariak. But Vincent's magnificent work, which we are enjoying the legacy of, began because he heard two stories at two different times, reflected on them, responded to them, and invited people in to assist. And that grew into the World Wide Web of Charity, of which we have the Congregation of the Mission, the Daughters of Charity, and the lay men and women of all faiths involved in doing organized charitable work that some people call, nonprofit organizations. But it was through relationship building and storytelling and responding to a situation, a concrete need. So when we see a need, can we respond individually and invite people together? Sister, you're so right. Just begin. Thank you all very much.
I've been thinking of Vincent. I want to hear those two stories. Because, because we do study theory and because we have more luxury in our lives to be able to think in a way, it comes down to such basic things of being able, Vincent just simply responded. you know, and the Daughters of Charity that he began in 1610 opened the way for religious orders of women to be able to get in the streets and serve the people. And he began it in 1610. In 1650, Sisters of St. Joseph. And it's before then they would slap all the women in the cloister and just tell them to pray. And he had to protect the women, right? And so for women to get out on the streets, to be able to be with the people and serve them, Vincent enabled that because he just simply did it. And then we came, and here we all are. And maybe part of the thing you've been hearing about, the little, you know, rustling about Vatican and American nuns, has something to do with this. That we're not cloistered religious. We're gonna, you know, keep, you know, stay the office, but we're out on the streets with the people, and contemplation and action go together. And so it's to serve and to be there. But we all are called to do that. Look at Dave here, talking about those circles, of bringing people together. That's the road we got to start going down. We're such a punitive country. And we got to make that happen. And I love getting back to Dorothy Day and Peter Marr. We have to build a society where it's easier for people to be good. 90% of people on death row were abused as children. The violence pumped into them, they pump into other innocent people. So to build a society where it's easy for people to be good, and that's each of us, and that's reaching out. It's been a real gift for me and grace for me to be with both of you, all of you really, all of you here today. Thank you. Books for you if you want to get the book.